Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. This year I've made a video every month talking about 8 books that are scheduled for publication, at least in the US that month. And today is the one for April. I know there are other booktubers who also make regular videos on this same topic. Rather than always looking at books most likely to make a huge splash, I tend to put together a pretty idiosyncratic list based only on my own quirky obsessions and personal tastes. A list that doesn't rule out literary hits, but doesn't lean heavily into that category. I hope at least a few of you will find books that intrigue you too, and I hope at least a few of the books I'm going to discuss today have not been on every other list you've seen lately. Coming out tomorrow are 2 books I'm very excited about. The first I want to talk about is a volume I suspect will be near the top of my TBR for Framed, BookTube's art readathon in September. The book is Adventures in the Louvre, How to Fall in Love with the World's Great Museum by Elaine Sciolino, coming out from the publisher W.W. Norton. The author shares her own love of Paris's tremendous museum full of the most astounding masterpieces in the art world. And in the process, as the press sheet says, she helps us fall in love with what was once a forbidding fortress. She takes us through the galleries and the gardens, as well as the backstage areas, I think, and introduces us to a great variety of artworks and also a great variety of people who work at the museum, including curators, the artisans who make the frames for the art, etc., even the firefighters who protect the building and its contents. This sounds just perfect for the readathon. Let me read you one of the many great blurbs. Sciolino is the Louvre whisperer. With wit, charm, and a scholar's bent, she walks us through the galleries, shining her light on beloved masterpieces as well as on treasures tucked deep into gallery corners, the ones that are easy to miss but can be revelations even to those who know the museum well. Habitués will make discoveries in these pages, and first-timers will count themselves lucky to have this book as a companion. This comes from Dory Greenspan, who those of you who love to read cookbooks will know. And here's how she ends. If food is your passion, it's mine. You'll revel in Sciolino's tour of the Louvre as a sumptuous feast. The next book I'll mention is special to me. The River Knows Your Name, a novel by Kelly Mustian. This is the author's second book. You might know her name from her first work, The Girls in the Stilt House, which was sometimes compared to Where the Crawdads Sing, partly because of its setting in a damp part of the U.S. South. Personally, I found Mustian's story quite a bit more nuanced and thoughtful. I said that was how you might know Mustian, but it isn't why I know Mustian. Kelly and her son, who is about my son's age, attended a family violin camp for a week each summer, where my son and David and I attended as well. We got to know each other the very first summer that we attended, when Abe and Kelly's son were in the same small class. Anyway, Kelly and I have stayed in touch ever since, and it's been very exciting to see her novels come out. In fact, she was writing quite a bit during those weeks of violin camp. Her new novel sounds wonderful. Nell, one of the main characters, keeps thinking about the paper she and Ellie found in their mother's old copy of Jane Eyre, my very favorite novel. Mustian's novel traces how their lives in 1970s North Carolina emerged from their early childhoods in Depression-era Mississippi. If I'm understanding correctly, the novel has a braided narrative, talking about not just different characters' perspectives, but different places and times. And place, I'm sure, if this book is anything like Stilt House, will be described in deep and deeply effective ways. Okay, I want to mention 3 books coming out on the 8th. The first is Mother Creature Kin, What We Learned from Nature's Mothers in a Time of Unraveling by Chelsea Steinauer-Scudder. By the time of unraveling, the author means the climate crisis. As the pub sheet says, quote, becoming a mother in this time means bringing life into a world that appears to be coming undone. And what she means by mothering here is not just the literal meaning and her personal experiences of mothering, which she describes in this book, but broader, ungendered ideas of caregiving and connection and loss and resiliency. I mentioned a somewhat similar book in my discussion of books forthcoming in the latter half of March, and Mother Creature Kin sounds like it has some of the same features that drew me to that earlier book: lyrical prose, an understanding of ecology and the natural world, and a worldview rooted in ideas about connection and community, and one fundamentally centered in the idea of creating a future, even in the hardest of times. I've heard several people compare this book to the work of Margaret Rinkel and Rachel Carson, whose books I love deeply. The next book I'll discuss I've actually already read, and I'm not going to go into detail now because I want to talk about it and some things connected to the book and to its author in a future video here on BookTube sometime soon. Andrea Long Chu, a young critic who has won a Pulitzer Prize for her work, has a collection of essays coming out entitled Authority, including what might be her most famous piece called Unliking Women. As the press material says, Chu defies the imperative to leave politics out of art, and she's interested in talking not just about books from Octavia Butler to Maggie Nelson, but also about theater and opera, television, even video games. And one of the people who has provided a blurb is Tori Peters, who calls Chu a galaxy brain level thinker. At the same time, she's cracking jokes, warming a fire, disclosing catty gossip, and passing you tasty treats. I have to say that I sometimes felt like I was swimming in a different generation's ocean, where the tides move much faster than the one in my slow Gen X world. The book can be exhausting at moments, partly because it just makes readers think so hard and so fast, sometimes because of that galaxy brain, and sometimes because she likes being what might easily be seen as pretentious. On top of that, Chu enjoys writing takedowns a little more than I like to read them. Even when the takedowns are sharp and funny, they sometimes seem a little performative. The essays I like most are the longer ones that are slower and more thoughtful. And it is from one of those essays that the book's title, Authority, comes. Chu is laughing about the fact that every generation worries that criticism is having a crisis of authority, and she lays out some of the history of criticism from the Enlightenment to today. Let me end by reading a longer quote from the press materials. Rather than succumbing to an endless cycle of trumped-up emergencies, Authority makes a compelling case for how to do criticism in light of the genuine crises from authoritarianism to genocide that confront us today. It is quite a timely read. Another book coming out on the 8th is To Save and to Destroy, Writing as an Other by Viet Nguyen, published by Harvard University Press. You might know the author of this book from his novel The Sympathizer, which won, I think, the 2016 Pulitzer Prize. The pub sheet calls this book, quote, a moving and unflinching personal meditation on the literary forms of otherness and a bold call for expansive political solidarity. Viet Nguyen spent his earliest years in Vietnam during the war and came to the U.S. as a refugee in the mid-1970s as a child. This particular book of essays began as a series of guest lectures at Harvard, where Nguyen considered how an author's status as an outsider can shape their writing, and perhaps vice versa. He's especially interested in how experiences of war and violence get discussed in literature, fiction and nonfiction, not only in his own work, but also in the works of Herman Melville, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ralph Ellison, William Carlos Williams, and Maxine Hong Kingston. Let me give you a quote that might give you a sense of what the author is considering here. What is a writer's responsibility in a time of violence? Should we celebrate fiction that gives voice to the voiceless, or do we confront the forces that render millions voiceless in the first place? The pub sheet goes on. Unsatisfied with the modest inclusion accorded to model minorities such as Asian Americans, Nguyen sets the agenda for a more radical and disquieting solidarity with those whose lives have been devastated by imperialism and forever wars. I'm eager to hear more of his thinking about this. The book that might excite me the most of all the books coming out in April is In the Rhododendrons, a memoir of appearances by Virginia Woolf by Heather Christle, to be published by Algonquin on April the 15th. I'll start by reading a quote from the pub sheet. Wide-ranging and prismatic, the fruit of an insatiably curious, delightfully brilliant mind, In the Rhododendrons is part memoir, part biography of Virginia Woolf, part reckoning with the things we cannot change and the ways we can completely transform, if we dare. This utterly original book will stir readers into new ways of seeing their own lives. And the publishers compare the book to a few of my recent favorites, Orwell's Roses by the incomparable Rebecca Solnit, and My Autobiography of Carson McCullers by Jen Shapland. I reviewed both of those books for Open Letters Review, I think, and we'll leave links to those reviews down in the description box. The narrative is built around a shared history of trauma between the author, her mother, and Virginia Woolf, but it's not focused just on their painful past stories, but on the effort Christle is making to create a future that moves beyond that trauma and the anger. She does that partly by interrogating her mother's past and how it weaves in and out of her own memories and the life Woolf lived. And I gather that place is very important in this story. Being in the houses and gardens of Virginia Woolf helps Christle work through her story. As the press notice says, Woolf becomes a kind of vital intermediary, a sometimes confident, sometimes mentor, sometimes distancing lens through which Christle can safely observe her mother and their experiences, in order to heal and to make what she sees as a complete transformation in the way she relates to her family's past. I'll talk about this a bit more in the future, but I think I'm going to pair this book with a new novel, Theory and Practice by Michelle de Kretzer, a book that offers a very different kind of campus novel about a graduate student who is thinking about the novels of Virginia Woolf. Coming out April 22nd from Pantheon is Medicine River, a story of survival and the legacy of Indian boarding schools by Mary Annette Pember. As you can, I'm sure, tell from the subtitle, this is an investigation of boarding schools for Native children, but this time in the U.S. from the mid-19th century to the late 1930s. Canadian writers and government officials, too, have been much faster to acknowledge the history of this type of education used by the state to remove children from their Indigenous families and communities and thereby encourage separation from Native culture. But this kind of practice was in no way unique to Canada. Pember writes about the tens of thousands of children who were pulled from their families to enroll in schools sponsored by the federal government and not infrequently run by religious groups, where students lived in terrible conditions and were beaten for speaking their native tongues. Medicine River was written by a journalist. When Pember was growing up, she learned about her mother's experiences in one such school, a seminary in Wisconsin, and she writes about how that time affected not just her mother, but her own childhood. Mostly, she uses her mother's story to be a lens into a much larger investigation into other students, as well as their families, who endured similar experiences, based on what the pub sheet calls searing interviews and assiduous historical reporting. I am so looking forward to this book, which is outside my own specific area of scholarship, but nevertheless parallels it in many ways. On to the final book, which also addresses fairly intense subject matter. Coming out on the final Tuesday of the month from NYU Press is Secrets of the Killing State, The Untold Story of Lethal Injection by Corinna Barrett Lain. My long-term opposition to the death penalty stems from the fact that the death penalty seems to be about retribution, and punishment does not seem to me to be the proper treatment for the state to enact. Instead, the state should commit to two other goals. One, the prevention of future crime, an immediate goal, which incarceration can do. And two, efforts at rehabilitation, which should be the ultimate goal. But Secrets of the Killing State is not about the legality or morality of the death penalty. Instead, it's a study of the brutality of the specific practice of lethal injection, a way the death penalty is quite often administered. As the pub sheet for this book says, most of us assume it's just a slight pinch and a swift nodding off to forever sleep, performed by qualified medical professionals. It seems like a humane practice to a lot of people. But the author argues that it is anything but humane. While there are botched executions, she's more interested in what might be behind the scenes, so to speak. She shows that, in addition to drugs leading to torturous deaths, there are numerous levels of incompetence and illegal procedures, including directly by the executioners. And all this takes place behind a very long history of secrecy endorsed by the state. By using everything from scientific studies to litigation files and interviews to autopsy reports, Corinna Barrett Lain exposes what she sees as a crisis. As the publicists write, the state at its most powerful moment is also the state at its worst. All right, that will do for this list, ending on a couple of pretty serious notes, I'm afraid. I assume I'll be making a similar list for books that are forthcoming in May, and I'll try to get that video out right around the start of the new month. Happy reading to all of you. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.